The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. And welcome to today's hearing entitled, "The President's UN Climate Pledge, Scientifically Justified, or a New Tax on Americans." Let me recognize myself for an opening statement, then I'll recognize the ranking member, then I'll introduce the witnesses. And let me say that because I was late, I didn't have an opportunity to say hello to each of you individually, but we very much appreciate your expertise and your presence as well. Last June, the Obama administration proposed sweeping new electricity regulations. Now, despite heavy and growing opposition to the proposal, the administration seeks to commit America to costly new requirements that won't improve the environment. The President has promised the United Nations that the United States will cut its greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 28% over the next decade and by 80% or more by 2050. He is attempting to write large checks we simply cannot cash. The pledge was made in preparation for a UN summit in Paris this December aimed at producing an international agreement that would impose legally binding requirements on the United States for the next decades. But all of this activity, at home and abroad, disregards the concerns of the majority in Congress and many states. The President's attempt to justify his actions with an alarmist, one-sided focus on worst-case scenarios establishes a poor foundation for sound policy making. When President Obama took office, he had an opportunity to work with the Democrat-controlled House and Senate to create climate legislation. But that effort failed because opposition to costly climate regulation crosses party lines. Congress has repeatedly rejected the President's extreme climate agenda. So the administration instead has taken the unprecedented step of attempting to create laws on his own and twist environmental regulations in ways Congress never intended. Now the administration has packaged up all these regulations and promised their implementation to the United Nations. But the President's power plan is nothing more than a power grab. Environmental laws can't trump the Constitution. They can't give the federal government the right to regulate the daily lives of citizens within their homes. Regardless of what the President may try to claim, Congress has not given him or the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to rewrite laws. Opposition to the President's agenda is widespread and continues to grow. At least 32 different states are openly opposed to the plan, and many now consider the possibility of refusing to enact his edicts at all. The majority of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate are opposed, and numerous organizations that are concerned about the cost and reliability of America's electric grid have issued dire warnings about the likely impacts of the President's plan. And the EPA's models show that there will be no real climate benefits. Whether that plan can stand up to legal scrutiny will take years to sort out. The legality of President Obama's unilateral action certainly will not be known when climate negotiators set out to create binding international rules in Paris later this year. The President's far-reaching proposals and international promises will do lasting damage to our nation, all for little or no environmental benefit. In fact, the pledge to the UN is estimated to prevent only a 0.03% centigrade temperature rise. And in testimony before this committee, former Assistant Secretary for Energy, the Honorable Charles McConnell, noted that the President's Clean Power Plan would reduce sea level rise by less than half the thickness of a dime. Meanwhile, middle and lower income American families will be hit hardest as energy costs inevitably rise. The President's pledge to the UN hinges on a questionable and unclear plan. The commitment submitted 2 weeks ago lacks details about how we will achieve such goals without burdening our economy, and it fails to quantify the specific climate benefits tied to the promise. Today is April 15th, Tax Day. It is a day that many Americans dread. As more Americans feel squeezed by rising costs, flat wages, and rising taxes, we should ask ourselves, can we really afford another extreme and expensive mandate? We will never reach the President's arbitrary targets, which would increase electricity cost, ration energy, and slow economic growth. Such severe measures will have no discernible impact on global temperatures. They will make the government bigger and Americans poorer. I expect today's hearing will demonstrate that the President's UN climate pledge is destructive to the American economy and would produce no substantive environmental benefits. That concludes my opening statement, and the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, Eddie Bernice Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me apologize early that at the completion of my opening statement I'll have to depart for another committee markup, but our subcommittee ranking member, Ms. Bonamici, will take over. We're here this morning to discuss the carbon reduction target recently submitted by the Obama administration to the United Nations. This target, which is known as the United States Intended National Determined Contribution, sets a goal of reducing carbon pollution across the nation by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by the year 2025. Before I get too far into my statement, I'd like to point out the fact that my colleagues in the majority failed to invite anyone from the administration to testify at today's hearing. It seems to me that the administration is likely the best source to fill in any details regarding the proposal or to address any questions or concerns that members of the committee may have. Despite this omission, I'm looking forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I welcome you. Some may say that the administration's carbon reduction goal is unrealistic and unwarranted, that addressing climate change will cause irreparable harm to the nation's economy, or that it is based on unsettled science. I disagree with such sentiments. I think the target put forward by the President is justified. It appears to strike the right balance between ambition and achievability. And perhaps most importantly, it sends a strong and much needed signal. I'm so sorry, this is my allergy season. To the rest of the world about the seriousness of the United States in addressing impacts of climate change. Such a position is critical to meaningful international engagement. I have been clear in my position that the time to address climate change is now. The potential cost of inaction are too high for us to continue to drag our feet or put our heads in the sand. A sobering report from a nonpartisan and well-respected group of business and financial leaders, including Michael Bloomberg, Henry Paulson, and Tom Steyer, entitled Risky Business, the Economic Risk of Climate Change in the United States, highlights the significant costs climate change has exacted and will continue to exact on our economy. The report presents a long list of concerns, including rising seas, increased damage from storm surge, more frequent bouts of extreme heat, and shines a light on the cost of inaction to private businesses across the country. However, the economic costs of inaction are not the whole story. There are also serious public health impacts associated with climate change. Greater risk of asthma attacks, heat stroke, food and waterborne, as well as respiratory diseases are all consequences of a warming climate. I know that some still question whether climate change is happening or if humans have contributed significantly to the impacts currently being observed. I know such opinions will be expressed again today, but it seems to me that most of the world has moved beyond such debates and is instead focused on taking concrete steps to address the problem at hand. We in Congress have to acknowledge that we are not the experts on the science and that allowing partisan politics to distort the scientific understanding of climate change is cynical and short-sighted. We as a nation must act today to address climate change if we are to preserve our quality of life for our children and grandchildren, and some old people like me. The negative consequences of climate change are not abstract scientific predictions for the far future. We are facing some of these consequences now, and they are affecting every American. The President's Climate Change Action Plan and the goals submitted to the United Nations represent common sense steps that will lead to a healthier environment, because acting on climate change is not only an environmental imperative, but a public health and economic one as well. In closing, I'd like to draw on a recent op-ed from Bob Inglis, a former Republican member of this subcommittee with whom I served, and Jack Schlossberg, comparing the challenge of addressing climate change to the space race. They state, climate change is only scary if we choose to sit, wait, and do nothing about it. Climate change is a chance for all of us to add a chapter to the story of American triumph and human progress. Courage of this scale will come from a people who are told they can do great things by leaders who believe that their people are capable of great things. We believe America will see opportunity in the danger of climate change, just like we saw benefits on Earth from travel to space. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Our first witness is Dr. Judith Curry, professor and former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology and president of Climate Forecast Applications Network. Dr. Curry performs extensive research that focuses on air and sea interactions, climate feedback processes associated with clouds and sea ice, and the climate dynamics of hurricanes. Dr. Curry also serves on the NASA Advisory Council Earth Science Subcommittee and the Department of Energy Biological and Environmental Research Advisory Committee. She recently served on the National Academy's Climate Research Committee, the Space Studies Board, and the NOAA Climate Working Group. Dr. Curry received her PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Chicago. Our next witness is Ms. Karen Harbert, President and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy. Ms. Harbert leads efforts to build support for meaningful energy action through policy development, education, and advocacy. Under her leadership, the Institute established the groundbreaking Index of Energy Security Risk and the International Index of Energy Security Risk, the first tools to quantify America's energy security on an annual basis. Before joining the Chamber, Ms. Harbert served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs at the Department of Energy. She was the primary policy advisor to the Secretary of Energy and to the Department on domestic and international energy issues. She also served as Vice Chairman of the International Energy Agency, which advises its 28 member nations on energy policy issues and orchestrates international responses to energy supply disruptions. Ms. Harbert received her bachelor's degree in International Policy Studies and Political Science from Rice University. Our third witness is Mr. Jake Schmidt, the Director of the International Program at the National Resources Defense Council. Mr. Schmidt has 14 years of experience in international climate policy with a focus on climate change, clean energy, biogems, and sustainable development in India, Latin America, Canada, and at the international level. He leads NRDC's policy development and advocacy on international climate change, including through climate negotiations and direct work with key countries around the world. Mr. Schmidt holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Muhlenberg College and a master's degree in environmental policy with a certificate in ecological economics from the University of Maryland. Our final witness is Dr. Margot Thorning, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the American Council for Capital Formation and Director of Research for its public policy think tank. She also serves as the Managing Director of the International Council for Capital Formation. Dr. Thorning is an internationally recognized expert on tax, environmental, and competitiveness issues. Dr. Thorning has made presentations on the economic impact of climate change policy at forums in China, India, the European Union, and Russia. In addition, she recently made a presentation entitled Investing in Energy and Industrial Development, Challenges and Opportunities at a UN Commission on Sustainable Development meeting. Prior to joining the American Council for Capital Formation, Dr. Thorning served at the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, and the Federal Trade Commission. Dr. Thorning received her bachelor's degree from Texas Christian University, her master's degree in economics from the University of Texas, and her PhD in economics from the University of Georgia. We welcome you all. You're clearly all experts, and it's just coincidental that two of you all have degrees from Texas universities, but that's nice to see. Dr. Curry, we'll begin with you.
I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to present testimony this morning. I'm concerned that both the climate change problem and its solution have been vastly oversimplified. The central issue in the scientific debate on climate change is the extent to which the recent and future warming is caused by human-caused greenhouse gas emissions versus natural climate variability associated with variations from the sun, volcanic eruptions, and large-scale ocean circulations. Recent data and research supports the importance of natural climate variability and calls into question the conclusion that humans are the dominant cause of recent climate change. This includes the substantial slowdown in global warming since 1998, reduced estimates of the sensitivity of climate to carbon dioxide, and climate models that are predicting much more warming than has been observed so far in the 21st century. While there are substantial uncertainties in our understanding of climate change, it's clear that humans are influencing climate in the direction of warming. However, this simple truth is essentially meaningless in itself in terms of alarm and does not mandate a particular policy response. We've made some questionable choices in defining the problem of climate change and its solution. First, the definition of dangerous climate change is ambiguous, and hypothesized catastrophic tipping points are regarded as very or extremely unlikely in the 21st century. Efforts to link dangerous impacts of extreme weather events to human-caused warming are unsupported by evidence. Climate change is a wicked problem and ill-suited to a command and control solution. And finally, it's been estimated that the U.S. national commitments to the UN to reduce emissions by 28% will prevent 0.03 of a degree centigrade in warming by 2100. The inadequacies of current policies based on emissions reductions are leaving the real societal consequences of climate change and extreme weather events largely unaddressed, whether caused by humans or natural variability. The wickedness of the climate change problem provides much scope for disagreement amongst reasonable and intelligent people. Effectively responding to the possible threats from a warmer climate is made very difficult by the deep uncertainties surrounding the risks both from the problem and the proposed solutions. The articulation of a preferred policy option in the early 1990s by the United Nations has marginalized research on broader issues surrounding climate variability and change and has stifled the development of a broader range of policy options. We need to push the reset button in our deliberations about how we should respond to climate change. As an example of alternative options, pragmatic solutions have been proposed based on efforts to accelerate energy innovation, build resilience to extreme weather, and pursue no-regrets pollution reduction measures. Each of these measures has justifications independent of their benefits for climate mitigation and adaptation. Robust policy options that can be justified by associated policy reasons, whether or not human-caused climate change is dangerous, avoids the hubris of pretending to know what will happen with the 21st century climate. This concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Curry and Ms. Harbert.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and the ranking members of the committee. I want to make 4 points today regarding the Obama administration's intended nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC. First, the U.S. INDC lacks basic information to allow a rigorous assessment of the goal. The commitment is long on promises but short on data needed for a proper assessment. Nowhere does it explain how the administration intends to get to its 26 to 28% reduction target. The administration's math just doesn't add up. We estimate that the announced and forthcoming regulations out of EPA, including EPA's Clean Power Plan, still leave between 500 and 600 million tons or more of the administration's commitment still unaccounted for. And without a sector-by-sector breakdown, we just don't know how the administration expects to achieve its target. Indeed, yesterday, EPA Air Administrator McCabe acknowledged in House testimony that they have yet to do a comprehensive modeling of all of the regulations that constitute this proposal. And surprisingly, nowhere in the INDC is there any reference to industrial emissions. It's hard to imagine getting there without addressing the industrial sector. EPA's current budget proposal notes the agency will soon begin considering new regulations on the refining, pulp and paper sector, iron and steel sector, livestock and cement sectors. So there's more to come. It's also difficult to see how this plan can be sold to the international community, especially given the uncertain legal foundation upon which it rests. In its Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA ruling, the Supreme Court warned EPA against using, quote, unheralded power to regulate a significant portion of the American economy, unquote. This certainly constitutes a significant portion of the American economy. 32 states have now raised legal objections to it, and the first case will appear before the Supreme Court tomorrow. And EPA Air Administrator McCabe said yesterday they do expect litigation to last for years. Secondly, the commitments are hugely unequal. If the world is serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then developing countries will have to take on huge commitments. However, indications are that that's not happening. China provides a very useful example. It's pledged to peak its carbon emissions around 2030 and to increase its share of non-fossil fuel consumption to around 20% is business as usual. In fact, in the International Energy Agency's most recent outlook, which was released before China and the U.S. made this announcement, it actually models the Chinese proposals and policies currently in place and comes to the same conclusion, which is they will peak just around 2030. This is nothing new. ExxonMobil's forecast confirms the same. To put a finer point on it, yesterday in testimony here, the Arkansas cooperative executive that testified in front of the House said that the most advanced coal-fired power plant today in America is in Arkansas, the Turk power plant. Under EPA's proposal, it will close. In China, on the other hand, they have 46 of these plants, and under their proposal, they can now build 44 more of these plants. India has declined to make a very aggressive proposal before Paris, and the Russian Federation's proposal actually allows it to increase its emissions compared to the 2012 level. Third, the administration's plan is all pain. It's poised to be one of the most costly and burdensome regulations and rulemakings and proposals ever. Its own analysis suggests that electricity prices will go up 6 to 7% by 2020 and up to 12% in other locations. And compliance costs could rise to about $8.5 billion by 2030. That's on top of what EIA released yesterday, which is an 18% increase in electricity rates between now and 2040 without the administration's Clean Power Plan. NERA, an economic consulting firm, did another analysis which said it's probably going to increase more like 12%, and compliance costs would be much higher than EPA forecast. We should take note of that because EPA has been wrong in the past. For their proposal of mercury air toxics reductions, which they promulgated in 2012, they estimated that there would be 5 gigawatts of coal-fired generation expired. Today, it's actually 50 gigawatts attributed to that rule, a factor of 10. And fourth, the administration's plan has no gain. It's important to note that despite all of these costs, EPA admits under the Clean Power Plan that the heart of this will have no discernible impact on the environment. And that's because of carbon leakage as U.S. energy-intensive industries move to other countries and deprive us of revenue, tax revenue, and employment. Our diverse electricity sector, which has afforded us very affordable energy as opposed to other parts around the world, will actually be taken away from us. Conclusion, we need the industry that's investing here, the chemical industry, the manufacturing industry, the steel and pulp and paper industry. But those industries may move. We need a predictable environment, and this actually upends the predictable environment of investing in America, which is bad for the American economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harbert. And Mr. Schmidt.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Schmidt, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to present the Natural Resources Defense Council's views on the U.S. target to cut emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025 to address climate change. We have a responsibility to protect our children and future generations from the effects of climate change by reducing emissions of carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping pollutants. This can be done in a manner that protects public health, spurs job creation, and helps address the significant damages from climate change. Acting responsibly at home is also an essential component of efforts to secure strong global action, including from major emitters. Our actions at home show other countries that the world's largest economy is prepared to rise to the challenge to address climate change. The consequences of inaction on climate change are grave. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change on our communities and facing substantial costs from these impacts. Strong and sustained efforts to address carbon pollution and other heat-trapping pollutants can significantly decrease these impacts on the U.S. and other countries. The new U.S. climate target is essential to helping stave off the worst of these impacts. The U.S. target can be achieved under existing law cost-effectively. Under existing law, President Obama has set in motion a number of carbon-cutting actions, including carbon pollution standards for America's power plants, improved vehicle efficiency standards, appliance efficiency standards, efforts to address methane leakage, and standards to reduce the climate pollution of coolants used in air conditioners and refrigerators. This new target will build upon these efforts, as all these standards have time frames that extend past 2020 to give businesses longer-term certainty for their investment decisions. The U.S. can meet both its 2020 and 2025 targets using existing laws like the Clean Air Act, energy efficiency laws, and steps to protect our public lands and waters. These cuts can be achieved cost-effectively while helping to create jobs and achieving important health benefits for our children. Time and again, American ingenuity, entrepreneurs, and workers have risen to address great challenges. That opportunity to address this challenge is why more than 140 entrepreneurs recently wrote in support of the new U.S. target to cut its emissions. As you know, U.S. action at home also helps to spur global action. For almost 2 decades, inaction on climate change in the U.S. has been a major stumbling block to securing strong international action on climate change. When the U.S. is willing to step forward domestically, it can have a catalyzing impact in other countries. This is evident in the new commitments from China and the recent one from Mexico. As part of the U.S.-China agreement, China's president committed to peak its emissions by 2030 with the intention to peak earlier and to build an increased amount of non-fossil fuel energy to amount to 20% of its energy by 2030. This is a commitment to even deeper cuts in its climate pollution than many expected was achievable just a few short years ago. In fact, prior to the announcement, many experts, including the U.S. Energy Information Administration, predicted that China's emissions wouldn't peak until well after 2040. And you can see that in other analysis. This U.S. action couldn't come at a more critical juncture. As leaders meet later this year to finalize a new commitment to address climate change, this agreement will solidify even deeper commitments from key countries around the world. Already, the European Union, Switzerland, Norway, Mexico, and China have announced the outlines of their new commitments as a part of this agreement, and more countries around the world like India, South Korea, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia are diligently working on their proposed targets as a part of the international agreement. In summary, let me conclude with the U.S. target can be achieved cost-effectively under existing law. When the world's largest economy acts, it sends a powerful signal to other governments that they also can and must act aggressively on this grave challenge, climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. Dr. Thorning.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, for the opportunity to appear before this committee. I'd like to make 3 or 4 points, picking up on some of what the other witnesses have said. First, it's not clear that developing countries like China and India will actually implement strong measures to slow the growth of their emissions. Second, reaching the administration's target of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020 seems unlikely, since we're only 9.5% down right now from 2005. So how we would reach a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025 seems very challenging. And third, how will the various regulatory measures described in the INDC to reduce carbon emissions impact the U.S. economy? Looking at trends in global energy use, the International Energy Agency's 2014 statement suggests that energy use is going to grow by 37% by 2040. Why do we think that developing countries will actually be able to meet stringent reduction targets? Their emissions are the ones that are growing fast. The United States emissions are relatively flat. So it's questionable that the targets that are being discussed will actually be met. What is the economic impact on the U.S. of the INDC? Investment in the U.S. is already quite sluggish. It hasn't recovered to the 2007 levels. Net investment, net of depreciation, is sluggish. Productivity growth is slow. Wage growth is slow. We need to be sure that the policies that we undertake aren't going to negatively impact our attempt to recover a strong economy. The question of whether developing countries will actually follow projected emission cuts, if they look at the European Union over a decade ago has implemented strong policies to reduce GHGs, to shift toward renewables. They've enjoyed very sluggish economic growth, very high unemployment rates, about 11%. So looking at the European lesson, why would developing countries want to follow that kind of a path? On the other hand, there are ways that the U.S. can move forward to try to slow the growth of emissions. There are policies that we can undertake that will actually be no regrets policies, will actually increase economic growth. For example, tax reform. Congress, Senate Finance, and Ways and Means are discussing tax reform. Scholarly research suggests that allowing expensing for all new investment would pull through cleaner, less emitting technologies and help us reduce GHG growth as well as other emissions. A study by the ACCF and Ernst & Young last year showed that allowing expensing for all new investment would reduce the cost of capital by about 25%, whereas the Bowles-Simpson plan, if implemented, would actually increase the cost of capital. Research shows that each 10% reduction in the cost of capital for new investment increases investment by 5%. So tax reform should be on the table as a way of addressing GHG reductions. Second, we should encourage the export of liquefied natural gas. Cleaner burning fuel to our allies and trading partners in China and India and in Europe would help them reduce their emissions while growing their economies. And recall that over 2 billion people have no electricity. 1.3 billion are cooking with biomass and dung and coal. So we need to try to export our surplus of LNG, which seems to be growing every year. Then we also should encourage international financing for clean coal technology. My colleague George Banks recently produced a research paper on that topic, and I would like to request that that paper be submitted for the record.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered.
So the third thing I think we should do to try to stimulate our economy as well as reduce GHG growth is be careful to use cost-benefit analysis. Other witnesses have discussed the fact that reducing U.S. emissions significantly will have no impact on the temperature or on concentrations of GHG. So we should be using cost-benefit analysis, and we should also be encouraging the adaptation to climate change through no-regret strategies in agriculture, for utilities, and other industries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Thorning. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And Dr. Curry, let me address my first one to you. Earlier this year, NASA claimed that 2014 was the warmest year on record. And then they put in a footnoted disclaimer that they were actually only 38% sure that that was the case, less than 50-50. That's amazing, but quite frankly, you seldom hear disclaimers from the so-called experts who always seem to be 100% certain that they're right. Actually, as you know, the scientific method itself actually says that we should continue to question and challenge our hypotheses, not just assume we're 100% right. So in many instances, I'm thinking these so-called scientists really aren't acting very scientifically. But in any case, I have a couple quick questions for you. One is that the President keeps talking about or keeps trying to connect human-caused climate change to extreme weather examples such as hurricanes and wildfires. And he keeps being contradicted by his own administration officials. Why he keeps doing it, I don't know. But who is right, the President or others who say there's really no demonstrable connection between these extreme weather events like hurricanes and wildfires and human-caused climate change?
Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who I regard as a little bit on the alarmist side, frankly, even they acknowledge in their special report on extreme events, weather events, and climate change published in 2012 that there was essentially no connection observed in the historical record between human-caused climate change and extreme weather events. They found a few regional examples where there was a trend, like heat waves in Australia and things like that, but really no, they didn't find anything. And why this continues to be touted by the administration is pure politics. I mean, people respond a lot more to extreme weather events than they do to, like, a 2-degree temperature change or something.
It's regrettable that we have the political leader of our country saying statements that we have reason to believe he must know are not accurate. So I thank you for your comment on that. Another question is that the 2% increase in global temperature is often seized upon as a tipping point, and if the temperature increases by 2%, all kinds of dire consequences will result. Is there anything magic about 2%? Where did we get that figure? Is it arbitrary, or is there some scientific validity to 2% and not 2.5 or not 1.5 or something like that?
Well, the 2-degree target was a carefully negotiated number, okay, that doesn't have much basis, you know, in science. The one scientific concern that was put forward was that this would be the amount of warming that would cause some of these tipping points, like a shutdown in the Atlantic circulation or collapse of the major ice sheets. But again, the IPCC in its recent assessment report found these to be extremely unlikely on the timescale of the 21st century. So there's really not much to that number other than a politically negotiated danger sign.
Thank you for that. And by the way, just as a side comment, the experts that make predictions as to what's going to happen 85 years from now or 100 years from now and are absolutely certain that that's going to occur, whatever those dire consequences are, the only thing I'll say about a 100-year prediction is that it's not going to be what is predicted. And it's too bad that, again, the scientists are actually not using the scientific method on that. Ms. Harbert, let me ask you, you did a great job of going through those countries and what they're contributing or not contributing to the UN treaty. But going back to China for a second, we've heard the promises that we've recently heard from China for years and years and years, and they never really come through on those promises. Is there any reason for us to believe that China is suddenly going to do what it claims it's going to do, and much of what it claims it's going to do isn't going to occur for years from now? Why should we be suspicious about some of these countries' commitments?
Well, China's priority is economic growth. And we look at all of the forecasts, and China's economy is beginning to slow down. If you look at the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, they forecast a slowdown which would actually show that China's emissions will peak just around the 2030 timeframe, which is what they agreed to in this announcement. Now, let's be clear. This was an announcement. This was not an agreement. This was not any type of binding commitment that the United States and China agreed to in the visit to Beijing. I think it's highly unlikely that we'll see anything happen before that. China is building coal-fired power capacity faster than we are. They're building lots of things faster than we are. And we're looking at an emissions trajectory that was going to peak at the time frame they are agreeing to. So this is business as usual. They'd already agreed to the renewables targets. They'd already already agreed to everything in that agreement they'd already put down on paper before.
Okay, thank you. And with the indulgence of my colleagues, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, even though my time is up, and that's to Dr. Thorning. Dr. Thorning, you're aware of this, but President Obama, when he was in law school, had as a professor a well-known constitutional expert by the name of Lawrence Tribe. Recently, Professor Tribe testified, quote, "The EPA is attempting to exercise lawmaking power that belongs to Congress and judicial power that belongs to the federal courts." He added that, quote, "Burning the Constitution should not become part of our national energy policy," end quote. Amazing statement with which I happen to agree. Well, both Ms. Harbert and you have mentioned the litigation that is out there. What happens if the Clean Power Rule is thrown out, as many legal experts, including Professor Tribe, expect?
Well, I think the question of how that uncertainty about future directions will impact the business community is significant. Uncertainty retards investment, raises the cost of capital, so we need certainty and clarity and transparency about what our policies are going to be.
Okay, thank you all for your answers today, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized for
Well, welcome to the Science Committee, the last place on the planet where we question whether climate change is being caused by human activity. Mr. Schmidt, it seems to me that the reality of anthropogenic climate change is really impossible to deny by reliable scientists all over the world. People are facing new challenges resulting from the rapid increase in greenhouse gas emissions, heavier precipitation events, consistently higher than average global temperatures, warming ocean, rising sea levels, increased incidence of extreme weather, severe droughts, changes in the spread of infectious disease, changes in ocean chemistry, and other ecological and public health impacts. Now, the scientific consensus about the contributions of humans to climate change is overwhelming. However, Dr. Curry and our chairman appear to deny such consensus exists, and Dr. Curry suggests, quote, "If humans are not the dominant cause of climate change, then attempts to modify the climate through reducing GHG emissions will have little impact on future climate change." Do you believe, Mr. Schmidt, that human activities are the main cause of climate change?
Yes, we do. We draw our conclusions from the vast majority of the climate scientists through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which surveys the landscape in terms of opinion and views and research analysis of the vast majority of the climate science community. And they've consistently found for the past 15 or more years that, yes, in fact, humans are causing climate change, that our contributions are significant, and that there are severe damages coming forward. We're at 0.8 degrees centigrade increase in temperature since pre-industrial levels, and many of the impacts that you've outlined are already being felt.
I would ask unanimous consent that we place in the record of this hearing the report entitled Climate Change 2014 Synthesis Report Summary for Policymakers from the IPC. And I would note that, contrary to the testimony of one of the witnesses, on page 7 of that report, they find that changes in many extreme weather and climate events have been linked to human influences, including a decrease in cold temperature extremes, an increase in warm temperature extremes, and an increase in extreme high sea levels, and an increase in the number of heavy precipitation events in a number of regions.
Without objection.
I would also ask unanimous consent that the report entitled Climate Change, Evidence and Causes, an overview from the Royal Society and the U.S. National Academy of Sciences be placed in the hearing record, and would note that on page 15 of that report, they find that Earth's lower atmosphere is becoming warmer and moisture as a result of human-emitted greenhouse gases. This gives the potential for more energy for storms and certain severe weather events. Consistent with theoretical expectations, heavy rainfall and snowfall events, which increase the risk of flooding and heat waves, are generally becoming more frequent. Trends in extreme rainfall vary from region to region. The most pronounced changes are evident in North America and parts of Europe, especially in winter.
That'll be made a part of the record, but I don't know if it's necessary since you read it all.
No, the rest of the report I would need more than my 5 minutes. Let me just ask you, Mr. Schmidt, as you're aware, critics of the EPA rule have a sky-is-falling attitude towards actions that would protect the health of Americans and do something about emissions, which I think kind of ignores the fact that the U.S. economy has tripled in size since the adoption of the Clean Air Act in 1970. Concerns are raised that the Clean Power Plan is going to cause residential electricity rates to increase dramatically. Those most in need are going to suffer the most. Is that the case? And how will the efforts to reduce carbon emission, such as the Clean Power Plan, affect low-income Americans?
Well, I think you're right to point out that oftentimes there's a sky-is-falling analysis that's presented, and we've seen this time and again in terms of environmental protection. When the U.S. First took steps to deal with acid rain, the cost estimates from many of the modelers predicted very significant impacts across the economy, and I think we found that the economy has grown significantly, and we, lo and behold, have very much lower acid rain as a result of that, and we've seen that excuse me, across the board in terms of many environmental challenges. When we've analyzed what EPA has proposed and what is possible in the power sector, we've found that you can actually make cuts on the order of 36% below 2005 levels by 2020 and 44% by 2030 in the power sector, with net benefits estimated to be up to $70 billion and $108 billion respectively. So these are significant benefits that can be achieved very cost effectively through things like energy efficiency, assuming real cost of energy efficiency, real costs of renewables like wind and solar, and reasonable transitions in terms of natural gas and so forth. And so with these kinds of efforts, we can see significant benefits to the public and to low-income families as well, and still deal with this challenge of climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. And the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curry, you mentioned uncertainty and the importance of understanding natural climate variability. Could you better, before inferring sensitivity to greenhouse gases and how there's been a hiatus in global warming since '98, could you explain how the administration claims that 2014 is the warmest year on record?
Okay, there have been a number of, there's about a half a dozen different groups doing these analyses, and all but one of them found that 2014 was right at the top. But if you look at the uncertainty in these measurements, even the no and the nat, most of them found that 2014 was in a statistical tie with two other years, 2005 and 2010. And the UK group, with a far more realistic assessment of the uncertainty, found that 2014 was tied with 9 other years statistically. You really couldn't distinguish them statistically. That, however, is not the way all this was communicated to the public. It was touted as warmest year.
Can you discuss to what degree our understanding of these issues are uncertain? What are the current key gaps in our understanding? Talk about the models, if you don't mind.
Okay. In terms of the climate models, the key issues, if you compare the climate models with the observed temperature over the past decade, you see that the climate models are running way too hot. Since 1998, global surface temperature has increased a tiny bit, and it's not statistically significant given the uncertainties, whereas climate models were predicting 0.2 of a degree per decade in the early years of the 20th century. So you're seeing this growing divergence between the climate models and the observations. The key uncertainties are how the models treat aerosols in the atmosphere, like little tiny particles. That's a major uncertainty. They don't get the ocean circulations correct, particularly in terms of the timing, the magnitude, and the pattern of these major oscillations. They don't include a lot of the indirect effects from solar variations, and they don't correctly simulate the effects of clouds, which have a very big impact on the climate. So there's a large number of uncertainties in these climate models and things that we know we don't have right.
When you mention clouds, you're referring to water vapor as well.
Well, yeah, water vapor. The biggest uncertainty and the biggest impact is from the actual condensed clouds themselves.
Is it also true that what we found in measurements in terms of deep atmosphere is in conflict with what the models should have shown?
Yes, the atmospheric temperatures from satellite also diverge even more from the climate models.
Is it also true that the models, the modeling does not reflect what has actually occurred over the last 30 or so years? There's a discrepancy, a wide variance in what the models would have shown the temperature would be versus what it actually was.
Yes, that's correct.
Then, in your experience, do you think this sort of rhetoric coming from the White House is unprecedented to the scientific community?
Well, there have been some rather extreme statements coming from the White House that don't seem to be justified by even the basic evidence and the assessment reports from the IPCC and so on.
Given the status of some of the scientists who raise these issues about the fallibility of the models and the uncertainty of the science, does that reflect well on how these issues should be debated?
We've gotten caught in this really toxic mess where this politics have become scientized and the science has become politicized, and I'm not exactly sure how to break out of this, but again, it's the job of the scientists to continually evaluate evidence and reassess conclusions.
If I may, I'd like to ask one question to Dr. Thorning. Dr. Thorning, the administration continually asserts that the U.S. can substitute renewable energy for fossil nuclear energy without negative consequences. As a matter of fact, they think that we should be at 80% renewables within the next 2 or 3 decades. Can you explain why we can't just rely on renewables?
Well, renewable energy, pardon me, I have allergies too. Renewable energy tends to be a lot more expensive than conventional energy from fossil fuel or nuclear. EIA's most recent assessment of the capital cost for renewable energy shows that new natural gas is about $60 a kilowatt hour versus for offshore wind about $240 a kilowatt hour. Solar is also more expensive, and because the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time, you have to back those up with conventional. So renewable energy...
Can I interject something right there just for a moment? If you have to back them up with natural gas or other fossil fuel, does that not indicate that renewables are not reliable?
Well, that is one of the drawbacks because we don't have the capacity to store solar right now and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So, and we did an analysis of states with renewable portfolio standards compared to those that don't. And the states with the renewable portfolio standards had energy costs on average about 20%, electricity costs about 20% higher than the states without portfolio standards. So if you're thinking of how to grow the U.S. economy, forcing renewable energy is probably going to retard growth, not help it. And, you know, because it has to be backed up, you're not really having much of an impact on U.S. emissions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer, is recognized. I'm I'm sorry. We'll go back to the gentlewoman from Oregon. Ms. Bonamici is recognized. I didn't realize you had returned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that. And I hope that my having to be in two places at once does not indicate my lack of interest in this important topic. We're also working on child nutrition in another committee. So thank you so much to the witnesses for being here today. Climate change is an important issue to my constituents in Northwest Oregon, and whether I'm talking about people who live on the coast who rely on a healthy ocean, or growers of our famous Pinot grapes in Yamhill County, or entrepreneurs who are developing new clean energy technologies. There are many people who are working to address and mitigate the impacts of climate change in my state of Oregon. Now, there have been several statements here about how reducing carbon emission has costs, but we should also consider the costs of inaction. We have shellfish growers on our coast, and many of them have spoken with me about the significant losses because of ocean acidification. Oyster production is an $84 million industry on the West Coast and supports more than 3,000 jobs in my state. Ocean acidification is threatening this industry as well as those in the Gulf of Mexico, New England, Mid-Atlantic. And this just doesn't matter to coastal representatives. It's important to restaurants and grocery stores and people who eat shellfish across the country. Now, later today, I'm going to have an opportunity to visit with some of the Oregonians who grow wine grapes in my district. And I want to mention that the wine economy in Oregon is valued at more than $3 billion and supports more than 17,000 jobs. Wine grapes are especially vulnerable to temperature extremes. Excess heat can raise the sugar level of grapes, for example, which, along with drought, threatens this important industry. So, Mr. Schmidt, you discussed in your testimony some of the increased costs associated with climate change. Do you agree that if we continue to do little or nothing, these costs will continue to rise? And can you talk just a little bit about the terms of lost jobs, for example, in areas like agriculture, if we refuse to act? And I do want to have time for another question as well.
Well, thank you. I'll keep it brief then. I think it is true. When you think about the impacts that have come from climate change, they are at the sort of fundamental components of the American economy. How often does it rain? When does it rain? How much temperature variability at certain points, and you're seeing some real-world examples of that in California, where they're suffering from a very severe droughts that are having a huge ripple effect across the entire economy and agriculture, and happy to share with you some of our analysis of ocean acidification, which shows devastating impacts potentially across the entire fishing economy of the U.S., which is significant, as you know.
Thank you. And yes, we also have outdoor recreation activities that have been seriously hampered this year because no snowpack. So in taking a leadership role to address climate change, the United States has an opportunity to further spur innovation and development of sustainable technologies. And Dr. Thornburg, thank you for mentioning the states that have renewable energy portfolios. I was actually in the Oregon legislature when we passed the legislation, and I'm proud to have supported that, to require that the state's largest utilities derive 25% of their 2025 sales from renewable sources. We have a significant amount of hydropower as well in Oregon, and one way that our state is working to meet this benchmark is to be a leader in areas like wind energy. We're involved in generation, manufacturing, and the industry employs more than 1,000 Oregonians. We've also made a strategic decision to become an international leader in the development of wave energy technology, and we've partnered with the government on some research in that area. So, Mr. Schmidt, you've established that we're already paying significant costs driven by climate change. Can you talk about how the UN Framework Convention will positively impact our domestic clean energy sector and innovation and economy nationwide?
Well, it'll have very significant positive impacts, we believe. What you're seeing in places like China and India is a massive expansion of wind and solar demand. India has a target to get to 100 gigawatts of solar by 2022. And I was just there in February, and I can tell you that there's a huge amount of attention and focus on delivering that. They have lots of sun. They have 300 days of sun, some of the best sun in the world. They also have significant wind potential. China does as well, despite this perception that China is not going to do anything for 16 years under this new commitment. That's just not true. They are building a massive amount of wind and solar. And so what you see happening is that the more that these clean energy markets are growing internationally, that American companies are tapping into this. And this is a key component when we talk to entrepreneurs. They see this huge sort of market potential both within the U.S. and externally. So the products that they build to meet standards and regulations in the U.S. now become the kinds of technologies that they can export around the world and tap into those opportunities.
Well, thank you very much. I see my time has expired, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot of different areas here, and I kind of want to explore two or three of them. One of the issues is, let's say we move forward with some kind of agreement with these other countries. What kind of a verification process will be put in place? Are they going to allow us to fly drones over their countries and do satellite imaging? I mean, how do we know that they're playing by the rules? Because one of the things that I've seen in other areas of our government is we play by the rules, but some of the people that we make agreements with don't necessarily play by the rules. And so how do we make sure everybody's playing by the rules? Ms. Curry, Dr. Curry?
I'll defer to the other witnesses on that. That's something that I don't have much expertise on.
Yeah.
The answer is we won't know. It is a voluntary, monitoring and self-reporting, as we have seen under. That's why we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We play by the rules. Many other countries don't, and that's something we need to be concerned about. Even though they have vague commitments, they'll have even vaguer ability to ensure that they're meeting their commitments.
Yeah, and also, I guess the other question along with that. So it's voluntary. Well, what's the regulatory infrastructure in those countries, and what kind of regulations do they have? The president's proposing pretty rigorous regulatory proposals, and this administration has put out a lot of very extraneous proposals. But how do they compare with the U.S., these other countries?
The answer is that there are very few commitments have been made. The deadline was March the 31st to make the commitments to the United Nations, and less than a dozen countries have made the commitment. So we don't know what the commitments will be going forward.
Do they have EPAs? And are they organized? Is there enforcement mechanisms as organized as the U.S.?
I think it's fair to say the United States has the most rigorous environmental, most stringent regulations on the books of the developed world.
Do you mind if I add some perspective to that? From our work in China, we have a major effort in China working on environmental challenges because it has many, as you know. What we've found consistently, and I think that they're at a critical tipping point. Anytime you travel to anywhere in China now, you see that the air pollution is terrible. That is a major challenge for the government, and they get that because social instability is the thing that scares them the most. And so the number one issue around social unrest today is air pollution in the country. And so that's why we've seen them begin to control the amount of air pollution and coal consumption in some of the key provinces. And just last year was the first time in over almost 2 decades that China's emissions actually declined by about 2%. Their coal consumption declined as a result of many of these measures.
I think you made one of my points there is that everywhere you go in China, it's foggy, and it's a problem. I think the other issue is, and Dr. Curry, you were talking about modeling and how the actual temperatures and projected temperatures and various models that have been put together. I remember I had an opportunity to travel to the South Pole a number of years ago, and there were some climate people there, and they were showing me these projections of temperatures back 5,000 years moving forward, and they were models because obviously probably didn't have thermometers 5,000 years ago. If we do, we haven't been able to find any of the recordings. So when those models aren't correct and we make a huge amount of policy based on what we think the models are and the potential outcomes, and we miss those models, what are the consequences of that?
Well, this is why I argued that for a very wicked, complex problem, some sort of, explicit targets and command and control really isn't a very good policy choice. And this is why I suggest that we need a broader range of policy options on the table that leave us less vulnerable to really getting it wrong.
Aren't we kind of betting the ranch on an outcome we're not even sure about and a problem we quite yet have defined?
Yeah, there's two possibilities. One, that we could spend all this money and really nothing happens with the climate, and we've sunk, it's an opportunity loss. On the flip side, if the climate really is going to turn out worse than we think, what will be left is inadequate solutions, damaged economies, and technologies that aren't up to scratch. So, we risk both of these things by focusing on these technologies that are really inadequate to the problem. We need to invest in better energy technologies that are really up to the challenge. Wind and solar aren't going to do it.
I say my time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Nogmeyer. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byers, recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I found myself deeply troubled by Dr. Curry's written and oral testimony, and I respect your career and your academic background. I'm grateful that you're here. But I found the testimony just full of internally conflicting facts and opinions, and in almost total conflict with everything I've read in the last 15 years in every journal I could get my hands on. So let me offer 3 examples and ask Dr. Curry for a response. First, you're highly critical of the precautionary principle. By the way, that there's a third option there, which is we do nothing, and the worst happens, and we are embarrassed for the generations to come because we didn't react. But you're highly critical of the precautionary principle. You say, quote, extensive costs and questions of feasibility are inadequate for making a dent and slowing down the expected warming. But in the very next sentence, you say, quote, the real societal consequences of climate change and extreme weather events remain largely unaddressed. Second, I'm quoting from your written testimony, quote, is it possible that something really dangerous and unforeseen could happen to Earth's climate during the 21st century? Yes, it is possible. But natural climate variability, let me emphasize, perhaps in conjunction with human-caused climate change, may be a more likely source of possible undesirable change than human causes. In any event, attempting to avoid such a dangerous and unforeseen climate by reducing fossil fuel emissions will be futile if natural climate is a dominant factor. And then the very next page, climate change may exacerbate environmental problems that may be caused by overpopulation, poorly planned land use, overexploitation of natural resources. However, it's very difficult to separate out the impacts of human-caused climate change from natural climate change and from other societal impacts. And so I'd ask, does it really make any difference? We can't change sunspots or ocean circulation or even cloud cover, but we can impact the human-caused part of this wicked problem. And finally, at the end of your written testimony, you say, there's reason to be concerned about climate change, which sort of undoes the first 8 pages. Okay. Uncertainty is a two-edged sword. Future climate outcomes might be better or worse than currently believed. And then you propose a different set of solutions based on climate pragmatism, accelerated energy innovation, building resilience to extreme weather, and no regrets pollution reduction. So it's almost like climate change is real, but let's not talk about fossil fuel burning and the impact on greenhouse gases on what it does to all this.
Okay, the confusion is this. Scientifically, the term climate change means a changing climate, and it's changed for, the past 4 billion years or so. Okay, this whole issue of human-caused climate change is a relatively recent notion. So climate is always changing, and it's going to change in the future. The issue is how much of the change is caused by humans. We don't know. We don't know what the 21st century holds. The climate change may be really unpleasant, and that may happen independently of anything that humans do. My point is that we don't know how much humans are influencing climate and whether it's going to dominate in the 21st century. Given that we don't know this, we are still going to see extreme weather events. whether or not humans are influencing the climate. This is what I'm talking about, that we really don't know how the 21st century climate is going to play out, and we should figure out how to reduce our vulnerability to whatever might happen. And that includes extreme weather events that are going to happen regardless of whether humans are influencing climate change. So maybe that clarifies my testimony.
A little, but not much. I mean, all science is contingent. We continue to learn. We must be humble at all times about what we know.
Yeah.
But it seems to me very much sticking your head in the sand to look at all the evidence of what has happened with global warming in the last 30 years. By the way, the debate over whether it's 2004 or 2009 or 2014 is the warmest year. It seems silly when 10 of the last
the climate has been warming since the 1700s, since we came out of the Little Ice Age. We don't know what's causing that warming in the 18th century, in the 19th century. It's not attributed to humans. So there are other things going on in the climate system that have been contributing to a warming over several centuries. We can't blame all of this on humans, and we don't know how all this is going to play out in the 21st century. We just don't know.
We just had a vice president who was willing to argue for enhanced interrogation and torture on the 1% chance that al-Qaeda might someday get a nuclear weapon. And are we going to do nothing because there's a greater than 1% chance that climate change?
There is nothing in my testimony that said we do nothing. I'm saying that what is being proposed is ineffective. It's not going to do anything. Even if the U.S. is successful at meeting 80% reductions by 2050, this is going to reduce warming by about 1/10 of a degree centigrade. It's not going to do anything. So I'm saying we need to acknowledge that and rethink how we're going to deal with the risks from future climate change, whether it's caused by human or natural processes. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor, very much. Mr. Chairman, my time's up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Breyer. Those were good questions. By the way, you mentioned head in the sand. The best example I know of head in the sand is the Los Angeles Times announcing a policy that they will no longer cover climate change skeptics, nor will they publish letters to the editor on that subject. I'm not going to ask you whether you agree or disagree, because I have a hunch you might agree that we need to be open-minded and continue to challenge our hypotheses. But
I will always agree, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Breyer. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curry, you are the professor and former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech. You have a PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Chicago. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgia Tech, you had faculty positions at the University of Colorado, Penn State University, and Purdue University. There's a lot of us, probably especially on this side of the aisle, who are confused, because during this conversation we have heard that climate change has caused snowpack in some states. It has caused drought in other states. It has caused extreme weather experiences in other states. I come from Oklahoma. We know what extreme weather is. This is very confusing to us, that climate change is causing these vast weather events. And really, when you're talking about states that are next door to each other, in one state it's causing snowpack, and the next door state it's causing drought. Can you share with us what your professional judgment is on that analysis?
Well, extreme weather events and weather patterns, it's really just dominated by random chaotic variations in the atmosphere and ocean circulations. There are some regimes that get established that allow you some predictability. The large ocean circulations, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, have big decadal controls on the weather patterns, and a lot of the extreme weather that we're seeing now has analogs back in the 1950s when the patterns were sort of similar. So trying to blame this on humans is really rather pointless. It happens to be weather variability. The strange weather that we've seen in the U.S. this past winter, with warmth and dry in the west and a lot of snow and cold in the east, has been associated with a blocking pattern triggered by a warm blob in the Pacific that's been there, for almost a year now. And scientists don't know how to explain the appearance of that warm blob, but it's something related to natural variability, not human causes. So,
thank you for your analysis. I think you've pretty much answered it. I'd like to direct my questions to Ms. Harbert. By the way, welcome from a fellow Rice Owl. It's good to see you here. In your opinion, how much coal, or if you probably have the facts, how much coal-fired power generation will the United States lose under the EPA's latest, most recent round of power plant regulations? I've heard it's about 100 gigawatts. Is that your assessment as well?
Well, we already know that between 2012 and 2016, so we're almost at the end of that period, that close to 60 gigawatts of closures have already been announced and are underway. Beyond that, we expect, and we see announcements every day, of additional 40 to 50 gigawatts. So your number is accurate. That's taking a tremendous amount of power off of the system with little plan to replace it with anything sustainable.
So one of the things I'm hearing is that that's about 1/3 of total coal-fired capacity in our country. Is your analysis similar? Is that about right?
That's accurate.
Okay. For my state of Oklahoma, we derive most of our electricity from coal, and those coal-fired power plants are being shuttered. Can you explain for my constituents at home what this means to their electricity prices?
Absolutely. In the state of Oklahoma, the estimate is that the prices of electricity under this proposal would go up between 18 and 21%, 21% at the peak. Now, it's very important to understand that 21% is on top of what is already forecast by EIA of an 18% increase. So you're looking at a huge increase in Oklahoma, and particularly when you're looking at 55% of the households in Oklahoma contribute more than 20% of their income. They're low-income households. This is going to hit 55% of those the hardest.
So it hurts the poor the most.
It hurts the poor and the elderly the worst.
So when you think about current and proposed regulations, the Clean Power Plan, CAFE standards, among others, these lead to necessary reductions to achieve the United States. Will these achieve the United States' intended nationally determined contribution?
Today we're enjoying low electricity prices and low natural gas prices. These proposals will eliminate that comparative advantage and still not meet the goals that are laid out in the INDC.
If we're to reach our commitment of 26 to 28% reduction, will that mean also shuttering natural gas-fired power plants?
With the multitude of regulations, including ozone, you're not going to be able to build new capacity. So that won't even shutter ones. It will not allow you to build new ones. So we're looking at a very big, different economy by 2025. And I think you should note that 40% of the commitment the administration made in their INDC, they have not accounted for how they're going to reach it. So more to come.
My constituents have been very concerned about coal. This shocks me that they also need to be worried about natural gas-fired power plants. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Feinstein. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Harbert, you mentioned in your testimony the Turk plant, which happens to be in my district, and I've had the opportunity to visit the Turk plant. I'm also an engineer and have designed many industrial facilities, and it's a very impressive plant. And I'll say this about all of manufacturing in the U.S., the facilities I've been involved with, that go to great extents to meet all permitting requirements. They're very conscientious about being good stewards of the environment. But when we see a plant like the Turk plant that's a super hypercritical coal facility, best technology in the world, if that plant can't meet emissions, that's simply saying that we're going to abandon coal as a fuel source if we can't use technology like at the Turk plant. And when we look across the renewable energy spectrum, which I've done projects in renewable energy as well, they're not nearly as economically competitive as traditional fuels. And we also see that they've got technical problems with peak demands and baseline loads. So I think my question is more of a questioning the overall premise of our energy policy and our effort to use more renewables. Wouldn't it make more sense, while traditional energy prices are low, to divert more research into renewables to make those technologies more efficient, so that as we make our traditional fuels more scarce in the future, our renewables become more economic and will provide a much better energy source for the future. So I know you work with the 21st Century Institute for 21st Century Energy. I would like to get your input, and maybe even Dr. Curry's input, on how we need to maybe rethink the premise of our whole energy policy and our the way we address using renewables in the future.
I think 2 quick points. It is ironic that under the administration's proposal that we would be forced to close the Turk plant because it cannot meet the expectations of the proposal, and yet to highlight the disparity in obligations, China will continue to be able to build those plants, 54 new plants just like that one, and yet we can't build one here. You know, the idea should be, the idea under this administration's proposal is to make today's affordable energy more expensive. And what we should be focusing on is making a broad variety of energy more affordable, including alternatives like wind and solar, making them more competitive and let the market work. That's what's good for the American economy. That's what's good for the consumer. That's what's good for your constituents. But this is going to raise electricity prices in Arkansas. And particularly, if you look at Arkansas, you've got 61% of the households in Arkansas which are considered low-income households, which spend 20% of their income on energy. They're going to be hit the worst. We should be offering them more options, not fewer, more expensive options.
Dr. Curry, would you like to add to that?
I'll just make a comment about wind energy and solar energy, the great intermittence and the challenges of integrating wind and solar power into the grid. My company provides weather forecasts, and one of the things we do is predict wind power, and it's enormously variable. Ramps are very unpredictable, and you basically have to have a backup power supply already. And so you have to make, the day before, you have to make a commitment as to whether you're going to fire up the coal burner or the gas burner or whatever backup power source. And you just don't know. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And so it's very difficult to integrate into the grid, and it's not clear, because of the backup power sources and the extra power required to ramp up these burners, whether you're actually saving any CO2 emissions in this process. So we really need substantially better technologies if this is going to meaningfully reduce the CO2 emissions.
Yeah, when we talk about CO2 emissions, even some of the policies that come out of here seem to be counterproductive to reducing CO2 emissions, even with our forests that we fail to manage properly, that emit 70, 80, 90 million tons per year of carbon into the atmosphere because we haven't managed those forests correctly. So I think we just need to focus on the science and how to make all of our energy sources more economical for the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm out of time.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Harbert, in your testimony, you said that the numbers of the U.S. pledge to the United Nations do not add up. I wonder if you would expound on that a little bit for me.
Certainly. If you take all of the stated regulations that they have put into their INDC and add up the EPA's estimated carbon reductions, they still come up 40% short. So it is evident that there is more action that's going to be needed to meet that 26 to 28% cut. On top of that, in that submission to the United Nations, they say that we're going to meet an additional target of an 80% reduction by 2050 with absolutely no plan, no proposal, no narrative, no evidence of how we're going to get there. So the math does not add up.
Okay. I remember when Australia passed the Australian version of cap and trade, national energy tax, whatever, and I met with two members of Parliament yesterday. One of them, I guess, was the essential of our Senate, and the other one represented essentially our House. and they told me that Australia rescinded their national energy tax cap and trade plan, said it was the biggest mistake, both of them, and they were Liberal Party, by the way, both of them said it was, in their opinion, the biggest mistake their government ever made.
And largely and hugely unpopular with the Australian people, which is why the subsequent government, in listening during their election campaign, then rescinded that pledge. And by the way, Australia has yet to make a pledge to the United Nations for this round.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask why you thought they rescinded it, because we didn't get that far in a conversation, and now you've told me. I guess the cost of it was unbearable on the citizens, and they were losing business left and right, is what they told me. They didn't tell me about the grassroots uprising. And
they have a very dependent economy on coal and coal production, and that was certainly under threat. They're a mining economy. But we also just don't have to look to Australia. I think somebody mentioned in testimony earlier, we just need to look across the pond to Europe about what we don't want to do. And you look at what has happened under the cap and trading system in Europe, and electricity prices have gone up, emissions have not gone down, they have not met their Kyoto requirements. And here in the United States, without all of these government mandates and based on the private sector initiative and innovation, we have, in essence, met what would have been our Kyoto targets. So we can prove that energy and the environment can coexist. And those that would like to have the argument that it's energy or the environment need to understand that that's not the path that the economies of the world and the developing economies are going to pursue.
I know during the National Prayer Breakfast, I guess, was, and I don't remember the title from Spain, but pretty much lectured us on the responsibility of adopting a cap and trade policy. Are you familiar with where they are with their policy in Spain?
I know that Spain has heavily relied on subsidizing renewable energy and subsequently hemorrhaged a tremendous amount of jobs, about a 2-for-1 job loss in the renewable industry, and so they have largely abandoned that proposal. You know, I would call your attention to an article in today's New York Times about this exact issue, and the New York Times itself says that, you know, no poor nation can take care of its environment, and so we should be very careful in how we approach this, that if you don't offer people an opportunity, we're never going to get to a point to resolve this on a global basis.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Molinar, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being here today and for your testimony. And I wanted to just share a story with you and then ask you maybe some questions. The situation we had in Michigan a while back in my district, where we had a major manufacturer of polycrystalline silicon, which goes into solar panels, and very excited about the solar markets. One of the challenges with that is the main criteria for that company to be successful making that product that goes into solar panels was low-cost electricity. And so we actually had an investment go from our state to a different state because there was lower cost electricity. Now what I'm hearing in Michigan is that we are going to be losing a number of our coal plants. And I think, in my understanding is in China, they are building more and more coal plants, which will then allow them to be much more competitive actually in building solar panels. And so I guess one of the questions I had, Dr. Thorning, I think it was in Mr. Schmidt's testimony, he stated that China's President Xi Jinping, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, committed to peak the carbon pollution by 2030, but I think the actual agreement released by the White House says China intends to achieve the peaking of carbon dioxide emissions around 2030 rather than by 2030. And I guess my question, Dr. Thorning, is this. If other countries don't make the same level of commitment that we're making, and we sort of unilaterally disarm with our coal plants that would actually allow us to be leaders in manufacturing because of the low cost electricity, aren't we paying a huge political price or competitive price for a kind of a political statement that says we're doing something at the same time when others may not be equally committed to that, and sort of a unilateral disarmament, if you will.
That's really the central theme of my testimony, that we would be incurring substantial cost, and as Dr. Curry and others have said, the overall impact on global GHG emissions is almost non-existent. So, and to pick up on points that others have made, a strong economy is able to weather and adapt to climate change. A strong economy can make the investments needed to slowly bring in the type of equipment that would allow us to grow and reduce GHG emissions. So if we go down this path that this administration is trying to push us toward, we will certainly lose competitiveness, we'll lose jobs, we'll slow our growth. The Clean Power Plan is certainly not going to be helpful to the environment. And I'd like to clarify on Chairman Smith's question, if the courts ruled this as illegal, the question is what comes next. It would certainly be a good thing if it were ruled illegal, but the question is what comes next, because uncertainty is what's retarding investment. So we need transparency in our energy policy. So I think policymakers need to weigh very carefully as we go forward. If we make these enormous sacrifices, loss of jobs, low-income people disproportionately hit, states dependent on coal suffering the consequences of higher prices, what do we gain for it? And I make the case we gain almost nothing.
Okay, thank you. And then, Dr. Curry, I just wanted to get your perspective as a scientist. My understanding is, science moves forward when people are skeptical. They come up with new ideas and they test those ideas, and there's a peer review process, and there's an opportunity to criticize, and the academic freedom to criticize people's findings, and it creates a whole new scientific debate based on that. What strikes me about a lot of the argument around climate change is you have people who are saying the debate is over, or they're saying scientists unanimously agree. And to me, anytime someone says a debate is over in science, it strikes me as not really very scientific. And I'm sure you've encountered some of that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've definitely encountered that. And whenever I despair over what's going on in the climate field, I look at the recent collapse of the consensus on cholesterol and heart disease. Okay? And, even though it's, strongly enforced by funding and reputations and authority and groupthink, that these things, if they're not correct, will eventually collapse. Skepticism is one of the 4 norms of science. It's absolutely essential for scientific progress. It's our job to question the evidence and reassess conclusions. That's what we're supposed to do. However, in the climate field, there's this manufactured consensus that we're all supposed to step in line and follow. And it's rather bizarre given this very complex and poorly understood climate system. We need lots more debate. We need to explore natural climate variability in particular if we're ever going to understand all this. And it's disagreement and debate is really what moves the knowledge frontier forward, and this is being stifled, and it's of great concern to me.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar. Who's up next? The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield as much time as he may consume to Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Curry, it's very timely that you would end that last comment on talking about climate variability. It was mentioned earlier about the drought in California. Isn't it true that recent research has indicated that California has been through much more severe droughts in the immediate ancient past? And we've had a series of droughts. We had a drought in the American Southwest in the 13th century that apparently contributed to the decline of the Pueblo cities. Tree rings indicate that we had a major drought in the Mississippi River basin between the 14th and 15th centuries that contributed to the disappearance of the Mississippian culture. We've had 3 major droughts in the 19th century, mid-1850s, 1870s, 1890s, and then the Dust Bowl drought of the 1930s. Could you comment on that? What might have caused those?
Well, drought is nothing new in the American West. We've seen droughts in the American West in the 20th century. There was a drought of comparable magnitude in California in the 1890s, and then the mega droughts, 13th, 14th centuries. Again, these were caused by natural variability, some combination of something going on in the sun, the ocean circulations, whatever. The exact mechanisms contributing to those previous droughts are unknown, but we can guarantee that it was not human-caused drought in the 13th century. So natural climate variability can bring some unpleasant surprises. And in terms of extreme weather events, I would say that natural climate variability is far and away the dominant factor of what we've seen in terms of recent extreme weather.
Would you conclude that a drought that lasted a century or more would be considered a severe weather event?
No, I guess I would call that, a climate event, but it's, where you draw the line between weather and climate. Drought really goes into the climate territory.
All right. Well, that makes my point, though. I think that when you have major changes in climate, unattributed to anything man-made, I think it calls into question some of the modeling. And I think it was you that made the point about the Little Ice Age, but not much is discussed about the warming period, the medieval warming period that occurred prior to that I don't think can be attributed to anything anthropogenic. So thank you, Mr. Massey. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it.
Okay.
And yield to balance my time.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you both. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being here, all of you esteemed witnesses. Dr. Thorning, I would ask you, first a comment. I'm worried that regulations associated with climate change will increase the cost of energy to American citizens. It's a big issue in my district in Texas 36. Especially hardworking families are already struggling to get by. Could you describe how increased energy costs impact the macroeconomic health of the United States, both for primary energy users and end-use consumers?
Certainly. The overall impact of higher energy prices impacts low-income minority communities severely, because low-income people may spend 15 to 20% of their income on energy. And in your state of Texas, which has one of the highest electricity prices in the country, I think is due in part to the renewable portfolio standards that have been put in place there. So it's macroeconomic studies over the last decade analyzing cap-and-trade proposals, many of which the ACCF has prepared and put forward, show significant impacts across the economy, because as electricity prices rise, you tend to see loss of manufacturing jobs, you tend to see outsourcing of jobs, you tend to see people spending more on energy and less on other goods and services. So the whole economy is dragged down as one important component is increased in price. So that's why I think it's imperative that our policymakers weigh the costs and the benefits of the proposals that this administration has put forth and EPA's plans, because as we've already discussed, the impact of curbing our emissions here will have almost no impact on global concentrations.
So I assume that high energy prices are spilling over and impacting everyday items as well.
Yes, and the
entire economy.
The converse is true. Due to the fall in the price of natural gas because of hydraulic fracturing, we've seen a moderation of electricity prices. We've seen the resurgence of manufacturing industries who use natural gas as a feedstock. We've seen a lot more activity and job growth in that sector. So that's been a great boon to the economy, and policies that make those more difficult are certainly going to slow our economic recovery.
Absolutely. Okay, so do you think, going right along with those same along those same lines, do these energy prices impact national security as well and the stability of our financial markets?
Yes, because as energy prices rise, that means we're diverting resources to the consumption of energy that could perhaps be devoted toward infrastructure spending, health care, national security. If you look at our economy as a whole, if resources are going into a sector needlessly, in the case of the climate plans this administration has put forward, it will certainly weaken our ability to be competitive and to be strong nationally in terms of defense.
Okay, and Mrs. Harbert, would you like to comment on that as well? We're talking about stability of financial markets and impact on national security.
Keeping energy affordable and reliable here allows us to have a very healthy economy. And we need a healthy economy to be a very healthy, national security apparatus and to be able to exert our power around the world. They're inextricably linked. And to the extent that we make our economy less competitive, that we're more focused on domestic problems, the less able we are to focus on the growing threats of terrorism, etc. Let us not forget that also our ability to produce more energy here at home and use it here at home, as long as not to import and not to finance some of those countries and organizations around the world that don't like us so much.
Right. Thank you so very much. And to follow up where my colleague here, Mr. Palmer, I think we don't have to go too much farther into the history books to see that we've had climate change over the centuries, even during human existence, and not just going back pre-human. And this is something that's very common when we see our environment and our climate change for the warmer or for the cooler, for that matter. But I want to thank each and every one of you. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. And the gentleman, Mr. Palmer, is recognized to put something into the record here.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record a report called Activist Facts.
Okay, without objection, that will be made a part of the record as well.
Thank you.
We have no other members to ask questions, and so before we adjourn, just want to thank all four of you again for your testimony today. It's just been outstanding. We appreciate the time and effort you contributed to this hearing, and stay in touch with us. Thank you all. We stand adjourned.